Well, Mesk, we're back with episode 31 of the Big Boys Table. How you doing?
Soon to be 37. I'm kind of
Yeah.
tired, but I'm alive.
Hell yeah. So, we're going to be talking today about consistency in RTS. Obviously, we talked most recently about storytelling in video games as a body, and we used examples of ARPGs and RTSs and stuff as like ideal ways that we would go about telling our story. In this episode, I kind of want to tunnel in on RTS gameplay and just in general, the entire experience of playing an RTS. Because as you put it, I thought very succinctly in the previous podcast, you're looking to create an experience. And that sort of modus operandi, that mantra, transcends the idea that you're just making a game or you're just telling a story or just doing any one thing, because it's sort of all encompassing. And so I thought it would be prudent to take a look at how we would try to make an experience in an RTS. And it is still very much linked with the storytelling part, because as we discussed in the previous episode, everything is indeed reflective of your writing and of your world building and all that. So the $1,000,000 question for this particular episode is, how can we design an RTS setting, or what precepts can we pull into our pipeline so that we're not going to make something that winds up feeling inconsistent within the first chapter or the second chapter, or like if we made hypothetically multiple games, the second game feeling way disconnected from the first. How can we make things feel like, if there is some sort of disconnect like that, it's deliberate and will be resolved later on, and like that's used as a hook or something like that. Like there's no unintentional disconnect or inconsistency that ends up intercepting what we want to do, that ends up ruining what we're trying to make, what our intent actually is. And so obviously both of us have had plenty of experiences trying to make RTS stuff. I've maintained a bit more of a built-in philosophy for trying to tell a story within the StarCraft realm, whereas you've been much more unlimited, we'll say, about just cutting stuff that you don't like, rewriting stuff from the ground up, which probably is a better operation, especially since that'll prepare you for writing your own worlds in the future, which you obviously also have a lot of experience with, and something that I'm going to have to do when I end up making my own RTS in the future. And so I feel like this should be a fairly reasonable topic to go on to, considering our experiences in the scene. So I guess my first question to you then will be, how exactly did you get started adapting works that you had already made, or works that other people had made in the case of StarCraft, where you were adapting certain pieces of StarCraft to your Apex projects in StarCraft 2?
So for StarCraft 2, that project all started with Armageddon Onslaught.
Right.
So Armageddon Onslaught originated back in 2004, 2005 as a tech demo that came as a result of what was going to be a campaign. But Started didn't support anything I wanted to do. And I actually had that almost fully voice acted and a bunch of other stuff. All that got dropped. So the tech demo had the Pit Lord and a couple of other iScript concepts that then turned into Armageddon Onslaught, which was basically another tech demo. It was called the Survival Concept, 7 versus 1. That didn't really have a lot of writing when it initiated. There was loose writing tying it together that just gave it the setting. Basically, like the gods, the Greek gods specifically, fought like basically like a version of hell in a refactored history, and they lost. But the forces of the underworld were too decimated and too weak and whatever to basically like expand outwards and take over all that remained. So they rested, and time elsewhere marched on, and everything was historically forgotten. And then we enter our present day, where they rise up, gamers rise up, and then that's where our game type comes from. So since there was no single player campaign for Armageddon Onslaught, and there really couldn't be, that's it for the setting. There's really nothing else. There's like no like real sense of conclusion, other than you obviously winning the game. So any sense of storytelling has to be done predominantly through the actual units and presentation, which is where we get to things, how things behave and what they do. So it's not just that as Armageddon goes up in tiers, it gets more advanced units. You start to see ships. You start to see you were going to see that starbase that takes up literally the entire screen and blows up the map. But you do get to see Sethis and the Great Destroyer eventually as well. So eventually there was going to be a victory condition where victory is obtained by defeating the Great Destroyer. But that was one of the things that didn't really get done. But that was sort of like the real storytelling thing. But then we entered StarCraft 2. So obviously, as everybody knows, StarCraft 2 dropped mod support very early into beta because of I'm very certain it's actually exclusively because of Zelnique's manly sound pack. I think that Blizzard felt very butthurt that the vast majority of people preferred Brood War sounds over StarCraft 2 sounds. And Blizzard tends to be very vindictive and very vengeful about these kinds of things. They tend to go out of the way to target this kind of stuff, especially in more recent times. And it was funny how that started getting a lot of popularity on Team Liquid, and suddenly Blizzard axed folder hot loading. So Zelnique, who was not really a modder or anything of that nature, I think he was actually like a high level player that just was slapping this together and throwing it out there. And so he was like, okay, well, we'll just switch to changing stuff in the MPQ instead. And Blizzard, in quick succession, like a week or two or something later, was like, nope, now you can't do that anymore either. Get fucked. So down went Zelnique's manly sound pack and all of modding along with it. So at that time, I had been messing around with StarCraft 2 and trying to learn how the data structure and stuff works. I did, a Blizzard employee told me how to enable lava. There was no lava maps in beta, at least early in, and taught me how to enable that to show it off. It wasn't really complete, but it was demonstrable, and we were also messing with the light settings and stuff like that. I think I had some of the first mod videos that were ever released for that game. But then modding disappeared. So prior to then, with Armageddon Onslaught, I had written out a very large amount of information. Now, the way I tend to plan projects is I don't usually write game documents. I didn't even write scripts back then, like for campaigns or stuff like that. The only time I really did write a script was for Saren Nubis Caledonimus, was for that campaign predating Armageddon Onslaught, which was for the voice acting. Prior to that, I never writ a script or a game document or anything. I always just flew by the seat of my pants because since I was basically the only one working on most of this stuff, except for sometimes I would outsource miscellaneous stuff, like maybe like iScript or something to HKS or whatever. They didn't really need to know the extent of the project. I didn't really need to explain anything because I was the one like doing like 99% of the work. As long as I knew what was going on, this was necessary. But Armageddon Onslaught 2 was different because I expected StarCraft to support much more scripting and programming than it did. Even though it was a foolish thing, I personally thought it was like unthinkable that we wouldn't at least see DLL support in the editor. I think Neverwinter Nights editor supports that, and this was in the age where we were looking at like Project Offset before that disappeared, but also like the rise up of Unreal 3 becoming more popular, eventually the UDK around I think 2010, 2011 or something like that. So it was kind of like unthinkable that Blizzard was at the time talking about the marketplace and stuff like that. So it was like they want to do everything they can to support it. Blizzard historically has not supported custom content, so it made sense they wouldn't know how to do it. They would look for ways to promote people to make their own tools. Well, that obviously didn't happen. So it came to adapting my stuff to single player, and I had to throw out everything I made, which is not something I really follow to the T anyways. It's just like ideas and concepts. Oh, that sounds neat, but in, actual active development, I'd probably throw a lot of it out. But then it came to actually making a campaign, which, of course, very undocumented. Nobody ever tried to make campaigns in StarCraft 2 at this time, early 2010. And, but by then, it was well known that the performance of the engine was absolutely horrendous. The game couldn't handle real build and destroy stuff. And at the time, I was focusing still a lot on an ARPG framework, using the earliest of the third-person engines ever developed for StarCraft 2 for testing. So when I first looked at a project like that, and I looked at how to bring in story and the experience into it, I always look at, okay, so what do I feel is a major shortcoming of a game that I know I can change? So with StarCraft 2, that's the graphics. I didn't have a lot of experience porting stuff for 3D back then, But I did have experience porting stuff for Warcraft 3 from World of Warcraft and some other stuff. So it was something I had gotten into, and I'd gotten into a little bit more with Age of Wonders 2. I was porting in Lineage stuff and other Unreal Engine game stuff, as well as some Gamebryo stuff from Requiem, Bloody Mare, and other things like that. I had ported those into 3ds Max and rendered them. I was very confident I could get them in StarCraft 2. It turns out I could with Intoxicated tools. So my thought was, okay, so if I don't like the way StarCraft 2 looks, I will just change it. So my first major thing I wanted to do is, since I wanted that experience, you were actually going to play as Armageddon in this. You were going to play as a hero in this. And this was the living world concept I explained in the last podcast for Warcraft 3, but modernized. And then adapted to Armageddon Onslaught as opposed to the writing that was for that project. And I don't know where this cat... Oh, okay, she's here. So I was like, okay, so what I want is an environment. So StarCraft 2, when you look at StarCraft 2, it is not very realistic. It's not very imposing. And it's very hard to read. So basically, StarCraft 2 is like the worst of every single world combined. It's difficult to read, and it doesn't look pleasing to the eye. Usually you make some kind of compromise. You know, sometimes certain proportions don't work, sometimes certain effects don't work, or stuff like that, because they don't look very good in certain viewpoints. Well, StarCraft 2 just doesn't look good at all, and it's very difficult to rate on top of it because of the bad proportions and things like that. But I was looking at something from a third-person viewpoint now, so I didn't need to worry about a lot of things like readability. I had gotten into Sins of a Solar Empire by that point. I did have some confidence in particle editing, but particle editing at this point in StarCraft 2 was not actually possible. So that was something that we wouldn't see until, I think, like 2014 or something like that. So I focused on environments. I think that environments are one of the most absolute important things for setting your stage for consistency. And the environments don't have to be elaborate or alien or whatever, but they do have to fit. So in the last podcast, we talked a lot about things like your setting and making sure everything is consistent and believable. Now, when I look at the gameplay perspective and I start designing like maps or stuff like that, I think a lot about what kind of a story does the environment tell? What can the environment tell for me by looking at it that I can use to my advantage to avoid having to put into words or dialogue?
Right, so you're trying to make the environments themselves subversive so that they do part of the storytelling for you, as opposed to needing to rely on tooltips and any of that other junk that you said you didn't like, but even also not needing to rely on dialogue for the point of getting those points across.
So say, for example, this was an example I used in one of my Apex J videos in the newer rendition of this project. When we have our player character first activating and fighting that guy who bunker rushes you, I called it the gamer check. We check people's gamer privilege and see if they actually manage to survive something that would require a minimum of 150 APM to actually survive. Let's say you defeat this guy and you proceed to the next phase of the map, which is like a 2 versus 2. Now, this is still, like, in the grand scheme of things, this is still a fairly low-key tutorial-esque map. What I consider a tutorial-esque map is a map that introduces you to core concepts, or new races, or new units, or new mechanics. But since this is the first map of the campaign, I can't really quite go as overboard as later maps will go in terms of enemy aggression and stuff like that, because every single thing is new. Every single thing is different. A lot of stuff looks similar, like a lot of stuff is Terran, but the numbers are all different. The way the resources is collected is different. We're back down to one geyser, you know, stuff like that. So there has to be some kind of acclimation period for the players, which means that I'm not going to try to overload them with a lot of stuff at once. That's why we have that minimalistic intro where we just introduce the concept that there's 2 guys fighting and your creation of the one guy, and you are fighting as a soldier, and that's pretty much all you actually need to know for this period. We start talking about things like the planetary shield generator and stuff like that, you know, like in the next mission. We don't even introduce precisely what the stakes are for what you're doing right now until the next mission. But we do a lot of storytelling through the map. So one of the things that I mentioned, I believe, is that nukes got changed a lot. They're much more like Supreme Commander ballistic missiles, where it's a projectile that can be attacked by certain kinds of defenses. And it flies across the map to its point and explodes. You will encounter this on this map. And they are as strong or stronger than traditional nukes within StarCraft 2. One of them would explode and fill the area with mines, for example. Others will create fire that will deal damage over time when you're standing in it. These are very, very dangerous things to have inside of your base. You don't want them reaching your base. Now, in typical Blizzard land, what we would do when we have a gameplay element like this is we would take away control from the player, show you a cinematic of the missile, and then give you back control and show an indicator on the map precisely where the missile is and probably where it's going to hit. This tells the player precisely what is going on and basically gives them a quick time event in which you now have a Simon Says, because this is typically applied to some like mandatory objective where you either lose the game or you can only take 3 hits and then you lose the game or something stupid like that. I think back to the shuttles, the innumerable missions in StarCraft 2 where you had to destroy shuttles trying to escape from different locations, and it's just a Simon Says. It's also not very dynamic because all that stuff tends to have very fixed positions. You have fixed objectives where the shuttles spawn and where they're going to go are all fixed. So there's not really much like actual thinking involved. You just build spore crawlers and defend the shuttle point and kill everything that comes by, and you wait. But the ballistic missiles are different. They are something that the AI builds and uses in some manner. I hadn't gotten this far because I wasn't sure how I was going to make the AI do stuff like blind fire artillery and shoot nukes across the map without having them run some fucking trace across the entire map, which through Galaxy is not particularly speedy. So this was stuff I had to sort of figure out the logistics for when we actually get to that point. But the whole idea was we are just replicating Supreme Commander. The AI builds a structure. That structure attacks. And you have to deal with it. But this is one of those very powerful super weapon-esque things that can really screw you over. And in all likelihood, if there's no way that the player knows about this beforehand, and we are in an acclimation phase, the player is going to get surprised by this. And it's not going to feel very positive. It's not going to be quite the interaction that we want. So what we could do is give the player a vocal dialogue warning from your advisor or whatever that says, hey, there's tactical missiles in the air. While I considered having that, I also didn't feel very positive about that because in our story context, our player character is at least like fundamentally aware of the kind of combat that we have going on in this era. I don't explain to the player that there's planetary bombardment. I don't explain to the player that there's capital ships with point defenses. I don't explain to the player that Marines can't fight tanks one-on-one. Like, where do we set the lines with these things? It makes sense that there's going to be long-range ballistic missiles because that's just the kind of armament that's deployed in this era. So I looked at it from an environment-telling perspective. What does the environment tell? We are in an existing battlefield. There are details we can place in the environment that tell a story. That is where we can tell the player that there's some kind of ballistic weapon that they employed, some kind of large-scale weapon, which means we look towards making large craters, large blast decals. The way in which we arrange destroyed buildings and other things like that can give hints that our opponents use large-scale weapons. Now, the primary contention with this is that in no previous any kind of campaign I have ever played has terrain detail been used in such a manner to give rates for gameplay elements. But the way I view it is that doesn't matter. If players willfully choose to ignore the information, if they have been trained to ignore the story that the terrain tells them, it's because they have played garbage games before playing this, and I don't have a responsibility to educate them to open their fucking eyes, especially if they have the skill to defeat the bunkers. My job is to make sure that information is actually there. So I look at it from a storytelling perspective in terms of what does the terrain do for me that is fluid and makes sense. Well, these guys are deployed. They've already attacked this place. That makes sense. They've already used ballistic terrain to soften up defenses. Ballistic technology. So if we show that there's a bunch of blast craters everywhere, but we are fighting predominantly tanks, marines, and some aircraft, it makes sense. There were some big explosions there, but it's probably not from the stuff we're fighting right now. We should probably keep an eye out for bigger artillery. Makes sense. Makes very, very logical sense. So that establishes a precedent. This establishes a precedent, and this is all tied together again. I was talking before about walking in with Armageddon Onslaught 2 and making a third-person shooter. It's a very different thing. But I wanted to set a precedent for that, in which I used pre-built maps for everything. So by a pre-built map, I mean a series of static meshes at a 3ds Max. I was going to ditch the entire terrain engine for StarCraft 2 because it performs so fucking badly. When you're in third person looking across the cliffs for StarCraft 2, the game hitches on a fucking i7-920. That's a doozy, my dad. That's a doozy. I don't know how Blizzard accomplished it, but they did. The cliffs can't be any larger than like 10 polygons apiece, but they lag a lot. So I was going to replace all with static meshes. I'll let you in on a secret. StarCraft 2 does not support collision meshes. Corbo is in your server.
Hell yeah.
He was the gentleman who first ported over my test static mesh I had created for StarCraft 2 and put it in the game and tried to make it pathable. It turns out StarCraft 2's maps were way smaller than I thought they were. So passages I thought were big enough for 2 siege tanks were barely enough for a ghost. And there's no such thing as collision meshes. So you cannot make a collision mesh for... I mean, the best example you get is the bridge. You can't go over and under a bridge because it's a 2D game. But it's not just that it's 2D, it's that you can't have pathing meshes. Now, maybe in modern StarCraft 2, you might actually be able to sort of do this if you manually paint all the pathing around. And use... they have some doodads that units can walk on now. I showed a screenshot of it where the Marines, when you had a Marine standing on top of it, the selection circle then displayed against the Marine. So it's obviously very fucked up.
Yeah, it's not very organic, we'll say.
Yeah.
Whatever the hell they're using.
That is some sorting fuck. So, but that was a precedent I wanted to set. And the thing is, if I set that for the first map, where we start off in a map, and I have a huge mesh that you're walking around on, like a fairly high detail mesh, it's just expected everything from there on is going to be the same way. And this is related to the concept about the ballistic missiles and stuff like that, because now we have set a precedent in both cases where we have introduced the player to a concept. And that concept is, I'm using the terrain as an instrument to do something. It's an instrument of experience. Either it's something where I'm educating the player on stuff that's happening, I'm showing there's certain gameplay elements or historic events that are relevant, or I've set a precedent in how things look. Now, the easiest way to make gameplay and stuff consistent with something like StarCraft is to make an RTS. Because people walk into StarCraft expecting to play an RTS because it's an RTS. If you break away from that, you have just destroyed every single precedent that the game and the player mindset and everything is ever introduced to walking into it. Which means you have to set something very consistent from the get-go that's very solid and fluid, which is what the ARPG design for Armageddon Onslaught 2 is supposed to be like. Until I ran into the collision mesh thing, that killed the project right away. But also air unit. Attacking air units, because I realized that was when I realized that the game was still 2D. And air units and stuff like that, like you could have those within those third-person engines, but they're very, very clunky. Air units in general are clunky, movers are clunky, they're all 2D. That put me down too. The skybox thing was another, and the particles displaying against the skybox being so fucked up. But also, that's when I realized just how bad the performance in the engine was when you had a single AI running. So
yeah, there's pretty much nothing you can do aside from small-scale arcade games in StarCraft 2 anyways. It sounds like what you were encountering, no matter what kind of style of game you were trying to make, was that the platform itself was very limited.
Yeah.
But prior to you making these discoveries, it seems like you had... it's kind of sad to say that they were novel ideas, because you'd think somebody else would have at least tried to put them in practice, if not come up with them and documented them somewhere else. But certainly stuff I haven't seen, packaged in this way when it comes to video games. Yep. So I guess my question to you there as a follow-up would be, when you're thinking about, like you described, for example, taking care to warn the player, but not do so overtly, to do so subversively with these environmental reads, which are not really reads in the sense that they are telling you about something that's active in the area right now. It's something that obviously happened before you arrived, because clearly they weren't there. It's not like they got created there in a cutscene or something, that you just see them. And that's like where your base is. And Maybe they deform some terrain and make some unbuildable, or maybe they do actually serve some sort of gameplay purpose beyond just telling a story. But they do tell a story. They do tell the player that something happened here, and it's up to the player to pay attention to that and wonder what the ramifications of that could be. I actually have a similar example, which is a little bit more low key, I guess, where in the very first mission of Hydra, I've made these crevice doodads, or they're just terrain tiles that show that they're unbuildable by themselves. They're meant to show like volatile ground, and I deliberately place them all around resources. And it doesn't matter what tile type they're on, if they're on high dirt or jungle or mud or whatever, I've made tile variants for all of them so that you can see that there's crevices. Wherever there's crevices, there's resources. Wherever there's resources, there's crevices. Like obviously those two precepts follow as soon as you look at your base and your ally's base. And so directly north of your base, but also in your starting vision, is for the first player anyways, is some crevices but no resources. And there's no gas in your main. So if you look up to those crevices, you'll see a geyser. And so the idea is that by following that read, you'll be able to see, oh, there's resources here. Stuff like that is much more subtle than something that's implying a weapon of mass destruction like you were describing. But it's the same sort of concept, I think, is that you're using the environment to guide the player without having to say, hey, you have no gas here, by the way, because they can just figure that out by themselves. And, hey, look at all these crevices all over these. We got to be on the lookout for more of these, which is what you would probably see in, for example, like the first Brood War Terran mission has a Marine deliberately say, this place doesn't have any gas. We gotta look for another geyser. And it's like the most slapstick fucking, like, no shit. I'm playing the game. This is the fourth campaign I'm playing, or fifth campaign I'm playing, and I'm getting this dialogue message. So, for sure, I think it makes sense. Like, I gave you an example where I did it. I obviously agree with the same concept. So, the question would be, before you get to the point where you're introducing players to this mechanic, and they get bombed with a weapon of mass destruction, and there's no warning beforehand beyond the terrain reads, unless they scout out and find it. Are there other ways in that same mission where you would clue them in to pay attention to the terrain to help guide them in a way that's a little bit less, like, could result in doomsday for their base, that could result in a restart or a failed attempt? Is there some other way that you worked that system in so that they actually did pay attention to the environment because of a certain mechanic? Or was this the only one that really came up in this particular mission?
Well, that mission had a lot of stuff going on in it. So when you break into the second phase, your ally, who's currently not active, will tell you that you have two choices. You can choose to aggress the enemy's main base, or you can try to secure a landing zone for his command module. So the landing zone where his command module would be has been taken over by the enemy, and it's not really like necessarily out of the way because there's resources you can take as well in the area. But it's sort of out of the way in that you have to make a choice between attacking in two locations. And if you choose to aggress the main enemy, it is implied that because the enemy has a position in this other location, that it is eventually going to become active. However, if you choose to attack that location and not the other enemy, that enemy will begin to tech up. So this is like an implication in that the enemy has taken a bunch of basically like some of the more free terrain that's more open. And if you allow them to hold that terrain as opposed to your ally, it's implied that terrain is going to be used to increase their productivity. Whereas that would be where your ally would be otherwise. So normally within StarCraft 2, it doesn't matter because everything is pre-placed and doesn't do anything. It just kind of stands there and waits to die. It doesn't even defend its own buildings because Blizzard makes good games. So the average player might not immediately realize that this is an issue. But they will realize it's an issue because as the enemy fortifies and starts building defenses all over the place, if they aren't successful in destroying the enemy's main, they are going to be fighting two very, very large locations filled with buildings that are going to be basically building as fast as they can, as much as they can mine resources. So that's another in-game situation that is more likely to occur than the missiles, actually, because the missiles are a late-game kind of thing. But if you just ignore that one location and decide to try to bull rush the main and fail, or are too slow about it, you're basically going to be looking at like 20 factories, 20 barracks, and like a dozen or more starports all producing units. Because that's how many structures are over there. So there's a lot of things like this where like terrain is really used a lot more aggressively by enemies in this. to build defenses, to take strong points, and just to build a lot of structures. Now, I remember back in Warcraft 3, in vanilla Warcraft 3, I think that they may have built 3 barracks in the end game as orc. And this was really unusual for Blizzard's AI at the time because StarCraft 1's AI was not very aggressive about economy or stuff like that. And Warcraft 3 is a pretty small scale game, especially in comparison to StarCraft. So for their AI to like go into late game and actually build like a third barracks was basically unheard of for the standard AI, but it also meant that they were going to be more aggressive when you actually destroyed their stuff. And then we went to Frozen Throne where they actually nerfed the AI and they no longer built these extra production buildings at all. And they made them a lot weaker. And that was a really big difference. So that was like sort of a shift that really tells you a lot. Like just like when it's a very small, subtle thing, but it impacted me a lot because I played a lot of verse AI games, and I noticed when they have the building and they don't have a building because they build so few buildings. And it's unheard of because, like, in that professional scene, when a Terran is on 2 bases and he's going metal, he's probably going to build like 5, 6 factories. And when he starts getting extra expansions, you're going to see him just plop down 1,000,000 extra factories because it makes sense. He has more economy. He's going to need to spend it faster. But the AI never reflects this. But we will walk into a campaign, and what we're going to find within Apex is that the AI is always about building a lot of productivity, which, especially in Apex, where we have tech structures, a lot more tech structures, and they're a lot larger, and we have more defensive buildings, and they're larger, and a lot of our production buildings are also larger. It means there needs to be a lot of space for those buildings to be built. So one of the things that this mission is designed to teach you about is how valuable build space actually is. Not just because of things like those missiles, because you got to pay attention where your buildings are, because eventually you start building mass fabricators and gas fabricators, and they both explode very violently when they're destroyed. So things like ballistic missiles are actually even more dangerous than just the missiles themselves. They can actually destroy your economy and cause your economy to explode. Which means that having positions to seed with minerals to build command centers is also valuable as well. So all these things kind of interlink into each other. But initially, early on, we set a precedent by stating that there's this large flat area that the enemy has built structures in, but hasn't actually built a lot of defenses at yet. So we sort of set up the stage that, for one, you can have allies in this. So that's already unusual. But the allies don't necessarily start the game with you. Sometimes you need to secure conditions for their arrival and then actually protect them so they don't lose their shit. And then your ally builds 20 factories and however many other shit over there, and then they're actually useful. So that's another precedent we set, is that your allies are useful. Your allies in this campaign are designed to be as strong as at least 2 or 3 of the enemies. Because you will be facing a lot of conditions where it's like 2 versus 5, 2 versus 6 or more, or large free-for-alls. And in pretty much every game I can actually think of, your allies are either indestructible and do basically nothing, like Last of Us or Front Mission Evolved, or StarCraft 2 for that matter, or they're utterly useless, but you also have to babysit them. So you might think back to any RPG you've played, especially like World of Warcraft. All escort missions are regarded with dread because they're slow, nothing happens, and if you so much as peek in the opposite direction of your escort, you will actually fail in many cases. So, as World of Warcraft got updated in expansions later down the line, some of the most appraised changes were causing your escorts to move a little bit faster so you could complete the quest in the same day you started. So, I'm not joking. This is actually real. This is how stupid this shit is. So AI allies are actually typically not something that's really regarded as a positive thing. Team play is not something that's ever been explored within single player stuff, especially, like first person stuff. Because I guess the general approach is that your ally shouldn't carry the game for you. And since your opponents don't actually threaten anything, your ally is basically just there to be useless. And then your enemy is also useless. So you basically ignore their existence, except for maybe as distractions. And I can tell that persisted within Legacy of the Void as well. But when I look at it, I'm looking at it as a story like a melee game. Each map is its own self-contained thing, which means that if you manage to take this landing platform and your ally lands, you should gain some kind of reward for it, which is going to be your ally is going to be like a sledgehammer to a pair of testicles. And they are going to militarize and deal a lot of damage. Your allies in this campaign build things like ravens, and a lot of ravens. I'm talking like 40, 50 ravens. And I'm not talking about the butchered Legacy of the Void Raven. I'm talking about the classic Ravens that were actually really good. And this is with the enhanced AI. They would also be using enhanced tactical AI. So you now have very, very powerful support, which synergizes very, very well with you, because things like the Ravens offer a lot of supporting advantage and a lot of offensive advantage to things like defense drones and turrets, as well as Seeker Missile, which can be attacked in this. So they're not like quite as strong as vanilla, but they're still very strong. And so now when you start seeing your ally building all this shit, you're going to be like, wow, my ally is actually valuable. I need to protect him and make sure that the enemy doesn't blow him up with missiles and stuff like that. So, with the way the map is designed, you're across position. You're a long distance from the enemy's main base. So, things like the missiles have to take some time to actually reach you. And you will have defensive structures available to shoot down those missiles. So, the player will find those in the tech tree on their own. But it's, yeah. I think I would probably actually have a mini-map icon for the missiles when they're in vision. Not an indicator that's always there, regardless of where they were, like what Blizzard does, but I would have something that's on vision that would maybe like flash or have a special symbol or something like that. Because you can do that in StarCraft too. Kind of like the boss indicators for like the hybrids and stuff like that, but not as obnoxious. Just kind of like in a Supreme Commander, you see a little nuke symbol on the map when there is the strategic missiles. And it's very, very similar.
Yeah, but it's not like it doesn't block out half the map. I imagine because the maps are also larger, you also don't have to worry about the projectile or like the symbols being enormous and blocking vital information because there's more of a map to go around, so they couldn't possibly cover too much.
All this stuff sort of synergizes together. It's all about making the player think more about the large scale than the small scale. StarCraft 2 has trained people to think about individual units and heroes with cooldowns. Right out of the way with the bunker rush, we set the precedent in that the vast majority of players, even really good players, are going to get completely caught off guard by this. And that's the entire point. It's the entire point to demonstrate, hey, your opponents are a threat, and they're aggressive, and sometimes they're going to do cheeky shit like try to bunker rush you and then tank contain you. The way that it's built is first they bunker rush you and then they tank contain on top of that. And you are actually in a disadvantaged location for this initially. So you need to have very, very good placement, very, very good production, and never float money ever. The way I had balanced it in just my initial test map was that if I floated 100 minerals, I died. If I didn't float 100 minerals, I could hold it off. And I had to keep that up. I had to keep that up because once the bunker rush fails, normally in a rush situation like this, the AI slows down a lot and gives you a chance to catch up. This AI doesn't do that. It goes to tank contain, and then it switches off bullies entirely and goes to full-scale attacks. So the way I have laid it out is that as it progresses through its rush, it reinforces its walls behind its contain. So regardless if you manage to defeat the contain or not, it starts to take a lot of territory and it builds a lot of barracks and other stuff on elevated terrain closer to your base and starts taking advantage of the terrain. So what ends up happening then is that as you push out of the contain and you take back map control, you're going to find the AI has built fucking barracks and factories all over the goddamn place. You need to destroy those to push into its base or try to push into its base and ignore them while it's producing units. But that already sets a precedent that, hey, while this is a very small scale early game situation, this AI is already preparing for the long term by, taking resources, building a lot of production and stuff like that. And then we expand outwards when we go into the 2v2, where we start talking about getting your ally set up, making decisions on if you want to target the enemy's expansions to the main base and stuff like that. So then when things go into late game and we start talking about, the tactical missiles and stuff like that, then it sort of like makes sense. We have a few more options available in the larger situation because this isn't quite StarCraft. It's based off of StarCraft, but our tech trees are larger. There's artillery and other stuff in them that we don't normally see within StarCraft. And, I would do things like change a lot of the way like siege tanks and stuff work, that their projectiles are no longer hit scan. So there's just a lot of like changes like that all sort of like flow in together to create more of a large scale experience. And I think it's all about making that experience that gets people into the mindset of thinking about it from that large scale as well. Everything sort of like fits together in that. That's where that experience comes in, because I wanted that RTS experience. And I would expect players by the time they finish this mission to have entered that mindset, to have entered that experience, because that's a precedent I've set. is that this is large scale, this is an RTS. So we never switch away from that. We never change that. We never suddenly play a fucking installation map where we move across a 256 by 256 map with shuttles renamed Elevator with a single Marine or a single Ghost or something like that, killing individual Zerglings and stuff standing around. Like, that's not even a game. You can't even call that a game. That's less of a game than fucking Clicker Heroes. We never want to do shit like that. If we don't have at least 100, 150 APM going on at all times, our mission's not engaging enough.
And not that there's much of an experience that you can draw upon for this sort of thing, but even if you are, having that sort of engagement, having that level of interaction and APM, and just inputs on the player's behalf, if it's a completely different genre, then it's still going to be a disconnect, obviously, which is like why I think the fallacy of saying I just want a change of pace is so pointless, because just play a different fucking game then. Like, why are you trying to play an RTS and then complain that it's an RTS through and through, which I have heard as a complaint about projects like what I do and what other people have done in the past. They've said it's too macro, there's not enough micro, and like then you're playing the wrong game. You know what I mean? Like, it's not the responsibility of a developer to just have a carnival ride halfway through,
It's funny because Supreme Commander players levy the complaint upon StarCraft that it's too micro-intensive. That if you can get more effectiveness out of a unit by moving it around, that's too much micro.
Yeah, I also don't understand the argument about that, because, like, what do you want exactly? It sounds like what they're trying to go for is like a 4X or a city build, or less of an actual competitive experience.
But even in those games, you can micro. I don't think I've ever seen one of those games where you can't micro. Like Sins of a Solar Empire, there's literally no moving turrets, and all the firing angles are based on axis, and everything is desynced. You can still micro by choosing where you point your abilities and where you position stuff. That's still micromanagement, technically speaking, and you can still get returns off of it. Like none of the arguments make any sense. What people are actually trying to say is they want the game to play itself.
Right, and at that point, it's a good thing that you have your gamer check in there. I have something very similar in Hydra, and I will in all of my projects in general. Not necessarily as aggressive as what you have, but it's more like what I want to deliver upon is to create a project that does challenge the player to improve as the project goes on. Even if you're a seasoned veteran of the game, like Connor in my server who does a lot of testing, these maps will at the very least keep you sharp. They'll at the very least test your ability to execute on these strategies that you know a lot already. They're going to throw new things at you anyways, because I'm going to be making tech tree changes and balance changes and all this other stuff, because that's what a custom content is to me, is not just a series of maps with the same tech we already know. It's actually figuring out if you can make a more compelling game state than what you already played. Because if you were satisfied with the game state of StarCraft, you would just play StarCraft. You wouldn't have the drive to make something different. At least that's my take on it. So when I look at it like that, I mean, even if you're a professional player right now, not that I think any of them will ever bother checking out content that I make, but the bottom line is, if somebody of that caliber wanted to play, they would still be experiencing a game that does test those skills, that tests those foundational skills that they've literally made a living off of. And so that's the direction that I go with. So of course, the first map isn't going to be the hardest map of the campaign, but it is going to be very, very consistent with the hardest map of the campaign, with the last map of the campaign, with the middle map of the campaign, with the next mission. And all of the missions are meant to build off of each other. And so when you play the first mission, there's a bunch of things that, as you put it, build into themselves and synergize with what you're going to experience later, what you are experiencing right now, and what you experienced 10 minutes ago when you started the map in the first place. And that to me is very important as a game designer, because the whole point of playing a game is, well, maybe not, obviously this is more like what I want out of a game, but I want a game that does challenge me to become better at it, that lets me, has enough onboarding experience to tutorialize things in an intelligent way, but still allows me to then demonstrate my skill. And anytime I fail in that game, I want it to be because I actually failed, not because of some weird bullshit that they threw in there, which is like a lot of what my complaints about the Dark Souls franchise tends to be, is that it's like, I guess I'm not adapting to the fact that it's a clunky gimmick fest, but like, that's not really what I'm after out of a game. I'm after something consistent that I can master, that isn't necessarily easy for me to master. I'm not looking for an easy game, because otherwise I wouldn't be looking for these kinds of games. But that's why I make what I make, is because that's what I think people are missing when it comes to this stuff, and that's certainly what I'm missing. And so when we come away from that sort of description, we can talk about how the fact remains that there really aren't any RTS projects, custom or otherwise, that do this sort of thing. And when I have, the first mission of a campaign or an early mission in the campaign, maybe players are still learning, but the point is to check if they want to learn in the first place, if they give a shit enough to not give up when they fail the first couple times. Odds are they're going to fail a lot of times. And I don't really do set-piece driven stuff, at least not in something like Hydra, which is meant to be very replayable and very dynamic. So what you were talking about with a bunker contain and go, or a bunker rush into a siege tank contain, that to me is that may be a tactic that an AI likes to use, but it is very dependent on the map design itself. It's not something that could be reproduced to the same level of effectiveness depending on the different layout of a map or something. And it does require a little bit of prior knowledge in order to respond to accurately, it seems like. I mean, unless you're really, really good and you can just take it on the chin, it seems like players of any sort of skill level won't be necessarily able to scout this out. Or am I getting this wrong? Is this something that they could theoretically? They can scout it out. And
if you scout early on, it's right. He's within reachable. Like, you can technically try to bunker rush him. So
okay, so in that case, then what you're telling me is that there's an AI that wants to bunker rush, but even if they get fucked out of that bunker rush and anti-cheesed in that sense because somebody does scout out, as you would want them to do in the first place, the player will get rewarded for that scouting by having an ability to either bunker rush him back or counter him. And the AI in this question is just planning ahead for that as a contingency, which is what you were talking about earlier, where he's planning for the long haul in case the bunker rush doesn't work out. He's going to try to tank contain. That's a little bit better because I guess my past experience with set piece stuff has basically been what you've already experienced in your RTS adventures, where it's just a bunch of pre-placed shit that nobody wants to deal with. And, there's no counterplay to it because it already existed before. I knew it wasn't going to be a bunch of pre-placed shit because I've already talked with you and seen some of the prototypes and stuff. But the same sort of premise was, is like this player has a set strategy and it's dependent on the map. And so usually that comes in with if I don't respond exactly the right way, then I'm going to get fucked. Where obviously you've made details you've let us know a bunch of details about the game state of the project and how you're trying to make it so that there's a bunch of different responses players can actually make to certain threats, as opposed to having to only rely on a certain strategy. So I guess in that case it's more about having a fixed opener for the enemy AI, which would naturally get easier the more you play. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to be a challenge. Just because you know what they're going to send at you doesn't mean that you can necessarily respond to it, which is something that you'll see all the time. But the
way it was designed is they actually just drop building bunkers and stuff once they're destroyed. So
okay, so they don't try to rebuild them or whatever.
It's a hybrid AI. Like, it uses bullies for the placements and stuff like that, but the core of it is still very much based on the refactored melee AI, which means that it's still very much going to behave like a melee player would in this project, like every other AI. But it has that initial strategy where it attempts to bunker contain and then switches to tank contain. And then at that point, it no longer uses bullies at all anymore. So it does transition. There are lots of tech switches and transitions that happen throughout all of these designs. Like, for example, there's a Zerg that built nothing but Vipers that can gank buildings and stuff like that, and infestors. But eventually they switch. They do a tech switch to all like heavy air, like Devourers and Guardians and Corruptors and stuff like that. And then there's the other Zerg that would build like Lurkers and stuff like that early into the game. And then they do a tech switch to like Ultras.
Okay.
And then all these Zerg end up like tech switching. But they're all like independent forces. But when they mix all their attack forces, all their tech switches sort of like synergize together. So again, very much about terrain.
Right. So here's another thing is, because building off of that point that you just made, you're just describing an AI team that each member of that AI team has a certain, predisposition to wanting to build certain kinds of units and use certain kinds of compositions and have certain kinds of tactics. And I'm sure that if multiple AI build the same spellcaster and added them to their army, they might even use that spellcaster differently. That's something that I do all the time with my AI, whereas one AI is going to try to, they build a lot of queens, they're going to try to broodling you. And in my reworked version, there's no more ensnare casting. It's an upgrade for broodlings that causes them to ensnare on death. And that's very different. So broodling also doesn't instantly kill stuff anymore. But the idea is, if you broodling a unit and the broodling spellcast, which deals I think 100 damage right now, if that kills a unit, it spawns 4 broodlings instead of 2. Otherwise it just spawns 2 and deals the damage. The idea is that now you have 2 AIs that, even though there's only one spell that they can use offensively, besides the parasite still works and it's a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same idea. So you've got 2 AIs, they both build queens, besides occasionally casting parasite, which one of them may do more often than the other. the way that they use broodling is now going to be different. Somebody might try to broodling your mech units, and they don't really care if they kill them. They just want to soften them up before an attack or something. Another AI is going to try to use broodlings specifically to disrupt your shit by broodlinging your marines, your medics, stuff that you wouldn't necessarily think is, they're not terrible targets, but they're not really prime targets by the conventional state of what you would expect out of broodling. But the change is still there. The effectiveness is still there, and it's a different playstyle. It's a different thought process that would lead a human player to decide to do that. They're trying to do different things. They have different agendas. So this is like an example of that, whereas you described different team compositions, different army compositions for each member of this team, that they're effective by themselves, but much more effective and much more scary if all three of them hit late game tech at the same time and you haven't killed any of them. Like, that would just be disastrous, probably. It's like, you're probably lost at that point, or at least it's pretty highly unlikely that you'll be able to come back. So that's we could go all day on just team presence and faction design and personality with the AI. But one of the things that I wanted to discuss that's related to consistency is the idea that you have players that are repeating. So you described Larry and you described Ricky as two examples of AIs that show up multiple maps and who you engage with multiple times in the story. And so, like, I discussed Warfield as well in that particular podcast. So I think that was 2 podcasts ago now. But the bottom line was that you have a whole bunch of experience with, one AI in just one map. And you're fighting them for like 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 2 hours, however long it takes. And that's obviously, it's probably not the only AI in the map if it's going to go that long, but who knows how long it actually is. The bottom line is that you have an experience with this AI. You know their playstyle to some degree. You know what they like to do. You know what their tactics are, their preferences are. And sort of you start to build a relationship in your head of like, here's a flow chart of what I think they're going to do. If you're really paying attention, you're starting to think like, well, I know that they like to expand close to their base or far from their base. I know they like to expand conservatively, but really try to hold on to those positions. I know they like to spam expansions out the wazoo and not really give a shit if like 2 of them go down or something because an enemy army flew through there because they have like 8 more being set up and 3 more active already or something like that. And so depending on what their actual presence is on the map, that's going to dictate what the player can respond to and how the player wants to respond to certain things like that. And so my question to you there is, like, given that sort of scenario, how exactly were you going about designing your AI personalities and evolving them over time? Because you're not only trying to get them to evolve and become better players as time goes on, theoretically, like they have their own strategies, but presumably as time goes on, they would improve in their effectiveness of pulling those off. They're also responding to something that the player is doing, which, unless you were tracking a lot of player inputs with bank data or something, theoretically not going to be something that you see too often. So how were you designing the evolution of an AI to remain consistent with their play style, or maybe not in some cases where they try to develop a new trick, and any, stuff related to this sort of topic? How were you going about doing that?
So, obviously, since we're introducing new races and way higher tech trees, every single time we encounter these foes again, they usually have new units. So those new units aren't necessarily about filling gaps in their tech tree, but more like setting up something that was perspective with their faction that fit their theme. Like, for example, Ricky is known very well for putting Reapers in bunkers. So when you first encountered him in Apex U, he would have Marines and medics and dropships and Goliaths and Reapers. And that's really like the vast majority of his composition. I think he built some siege tanks as well, maybe a couple of wraiths. And I would have adjusted him a little bit. So depending on his late game composition, he might add in some other stuff. But that's predominantly like the kind of stuff he built. And he just built a lot of them. Like, he always has an attack force on the map when he's rolling. And then in the second map, when you fought him, he would have Death Reaper X's. So the Death Reaper X is basically a Reaper, but now they would have their anti-structure attack that they otherwise had. The normal one didn't have that anymore. And it could also, I think it could attack while moving and maybe something else. But statistically speaking, it's not really that much tougher than a normal Reaper. It is more expensive, so he won't have as many of them. He will also have a more enhanced Hellion and regular Hellions and some other stuff like that. And I think the enhanced Hellion might have been able to attack while moving. Not that the AI was going to be very good at taking advantage of this stuff that attacks while moving, but it's still something that would be new and different. So these are things I'm more or less building on his existing roster. So something you would run into as well within that original concept, Apex U. I think it was about 2016 or 2015 U. And in Apex U, you'd also run into the Confederacy. So the Confederacy, when you first run into them, they would be one of the factions with the most highest available tech at that point. They could build the Corvettes I mentioned before. and some other like Confederate specific stuff, which is regarded to be like slow, heavy, old, and effective. So you can think of them more like as Germany compared to America in terms of their tanks. America was more about the light tanks, and Germany had a lot of the heavy tanks. And Germany was typically, at least in these specific engagements, I'm thinking of like Tigers versus Shermans, more defensive because the Tiger was slower. But when they actually hit the lighter tanks, it was pretty much just an instant kill. And I think Shermans had to like either get really, really close to them or behind them to hit the weaker points of their armor to really stand a chance of dealing damage to a lot of the German heavier tanks. So the Confederates were more about that more dug-in, heavier style, which meant that they built larger defense structures that were more difficult to destroy, but took longer to build and didn't have as much range or some other sorts of things like that. So as we go further into the tech tree later on in the missions, we find that Terrans more or less start to really their separate factions would really seek out their own identities. So the Confederates would start building larger ships, larger tanks that are slower, heavier, and more about that defensive mindset, whereas Ricky would really get more sassy. And Larry didn't really like restrict himself a lot of the times to a real specific tech tree. Depending on the mission which you encountered him in, he would sometimes command certain Terran specific forces. He would sometimes use Dynex forces. He would sometimes have access to those hybrids, depending on the map. But all of his tactics would sort of be the same, but the kind of way that he employed those tactics would be different. Like, for example, in the mission against the hybrids, one of the hybrids you encounter is actually based on a old world curse, which would infect everything and turn them into werewolves, kind of. And this would affect his units as well as your units. So while you are fighting the hybrids and their forces, I think a chunk of them are Protoss or Terran. I can't remember this mission specifically, but there was basically enemy factions, your ally, but then there was another sort of like wolf in sheep's clothing amidst his hybrids that would be affecting everything it touches across the map. So Larry would oftentimes, again, another mission concept I've spoken before, in which one of the big bads you're fighting against Sethis, Larry drags Sethis into the fight, and Sethis fucks up everything, regardless if it's him or you. This earlier mission in which you encounter this werewolf plague deal that curses units and turns them into puppies when you kill them, or over time, is a very similar idea in which Larry has introduced something that kind of foils his own plans, but is actually more threatening than what his plans were anyways, because he really doesn't give a shit about what happens. A lot of what Larry ends up doing or employing throughout the missions just exude that he really doesn't care about what you do with his shit. It's all about just delaying you as he does stuff off screen, or as he runs something else out of harm's way, preferably. So things get more dangerous because he gets more and more heavy-handed with the kind of stuff he's throwing at you and the kind of risks he's willing to take, down to pulling Sethis on top of you. And Sethis is basically a giant galaxy-devouring dragon that summons spirits that manifest. And some of them are kind of like Necrons from Warhammer. They're machines, and like thematically speaking, they're very hard to kill, and they have regenerative properties. So they're very, very tough to actually destroy. They're basically like what Xel'Naga should have been actually threatening. Whereas
Instead of
Xel'Naga
giant
are
squid?
just, yeah, instead of just like elementals and Void from World of Warcraft. Like all the defenses for the Xel'Naga are just so non-threatening. It's just like blocky Earth elementals from World of Warcraft that shoot
Yeah, you
some
just get hit with
lasers.
giant towers and have to. They do lift your units, I guess. It's not really. Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. It's.
But yeah, it's like the Sethis stuff is like you ask yourself like, why would Larry ever suck this into our place on himself? Why would he suck this shit onto himself? Because a single Necropolis ship is worth like 150 food worth of units. So you got to be really careful about destroying those. And he just drags them right on top of him just to drag you into it. He figures, well, I'm going down. You're going down with me. But he has like a history of this, so you will kind of sort of expect him to do something really stupid and desperate by this point. So as you engage characters throughout stuff and they evolve, the way I say it is it's not just about making them stronger, but it's more about exploring their identity. So the Zerg were based on Mucky, and Mucky is sometimes sassy. So a lot of what the Zerg you first encounter, like the one that spams and festers and then hard switches to heavy air, that one's more about trolling you than being actually really, really effective at killing you. And it's mostly your ally that weathers the burden of having to deal with the infestors and the vipers for a while. And if you don't help, then he will eventually kind of run into trouble because he can't keep his infrastructure up while he's constantly being harassed by just hordes of this shit. But at the same time, if you don't actually take the Zerg seriously and you get lulled into that false sense of security, the tech switch will really fuck you up. Even just on its own, the heavy air can be really hard to deal with.
Yeah, it makes me think of like a free-for-all player or something who like
Yeah.
trolls you most of the time while they're setting up like a billion bases to mass carriers or something insane. Like you just get completely caught off guard.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
That's the entire idea. That's exactly what I'm trying to capture actually, because I'm basically trying to capture the experience of playing those long Warlords of Merchants games, where people sometimes do different things, but you otherwise sort of expect a certain kind of behavior out of them. That's really what I was exploring a lot with these mission designs. The bunker rush thing is actually, I think, one of the only instances I can even recall from any of the concepts throughout the entire project in which I specifically sat down and have the AI do something very, very specific when I start the maps. And it is for the exclusive purpose of basically making bad people angry. So it's less about I'm making an engaging concept. It's more like I'm here to troll you for this moment. And if you can endure it, then you get, everything to come after it. Because as far as I'm concerned, like people who are in it just for the just not giving a fuck just for the kicks, just not really like taking it seriously, they're wasting their time and they're gonna waste my time. So the way I look at this stuff, because you're talking about challenge, like the best way to get people to be engaged with your project is immersion. And when you're talking about stuff like gameplay, the easiest and most effective way to establish a line for immersion where people give a shit about what's going on is to challenge them. You want them to think. You want them to adapt. You want them to pay attention. The only way they're going to pay attention is if they're challenged. If I can watch fucking like H games or something on my other monitor, or if I can be playing like Fate Grand Order or something on my tablet while I'm playing your campaign, you've done a piss poor fucking job. If there's any time I can take my hands off the mouse and keyboard and for like a minute or something, like say for example in Antioch Chronicles 3, where you're going through that slideshow map, or any of the RPG maps where you literally can just like go take a piss or something and not even pause the game. If you can do
Didn't that happen?
Yes, I'm very sure it did.
I'm pretty sure I pissed.
And if you can do that, then the map designer has failed absolutely spectacularly. I mean, okay, yes, you could play a very perfectly designed mission and bring him down to his last building and then go AFK or something like that. But in traditional gameplay, if you can just afford to just stop caring and stop paying attention for a while, that's not good. That means you're not engaged. That means you're not immersed.
I actually take that philosophy even a step further and say if there's anything in the, like, say, a level, like an expansion or a piece of terrain or something that the player can't even use to do anything with, to engage with, or if there's a line of dialogue that does nothing to further what the story, like what the player is actually getting out of the experience, or if there's any component of the experience that you're playing and that component doesn't justify itself in the grand scheme of things, doesn't engage the player in that sense, doesn't keep them invested, it doesn't force them to like demand a certain amount of attention, then why is it even there? Like if there's an expansion, like look at the I don't know how well you remember this, you probably don't remember this as well, but most people in the audience will. The last mission of the Protoss campaign, the vanilla Protoss campaign, where Tassadar 911's the Overmind, there's like 30 fucking areas of the map that are completely pointless. You never engage with. You don't even move troops through them.
I remember that actually. The whole map, it has a whole ton of fucking terrain in it. I think in like all the non corners, all the 4 directions. There's just like you never even need to go there.
Well, and especially in the corners, there's like a huge sea of mineral piss on the bottom left, and then there's like 2 or 3 geysers or something in the top right. And you'll never take either of those bases because you want both. And it's not even like they're in an area where, okay, I have to settle for just gas or just minerals because, but like there's still something else about this area, like the level design or the height advantage, or this is an area that overlooks an area that there's going to be a lot of units moving through. There's no value to these areas, not even like without even taking into context the minerals or the gas or whatever. So it's just like, that's the same thing to me. Is like, okay, yeah, if I am not actually playing the game for like longer than a couple seconds or 30 seconds to a minute or whatever, and I'm not being punished for it, then that's obviously just terrible. If like it's one thing if I'm able to A-move in like the Rexar campaign or something and I can come back from taking a piss and nothing's happened and I'm not punished at all. That's obviously bad, but it's like even a step further than that though. If you like that same principle needs to be applied to every component that you're making. And it all needs to be it can't just be like some things challenge you. It's like all of the things have to consistently challenge you. That's how you create that consistent experience. Is everything needs to consistently engage you. It might not necessarily be a challenge to wipe the enemy after you've like brought them down to the last couple buildings, but that's still part of the experience. Like the victory lap is part of the reward for winning and reward for defeating this enemy. And like, I don't know if you had like other examples of you struggling to grab that or seeing some other shit where it reminds you of that sort of concept. But to me, it's like if there's an area of the map and I'm never going to go there and I don't give a shit if my ally goes there or my enemies go there, like there's no value to it, then that's like the same thing.
All the fucking StarCraft 2 is like that. How many missions end with you ever, like, actually engaging an enemy base or needing to? Like, it gets to the point where you don't even think about fucking enemy bases anymore. Because the way that the fucking objectives have been designed for the maps is that you never actually directly engage an enemy. They're there just to be a fucking nuisance.
Yeah.
You're always doing something else, and then they're just there just to be a chore. So it's not even like about even playing a fucking RTS. Yes, because you aren't. Even in the missions you're doing macro stuff in, you're still not playing an RTS because you're not playing an opponent, you're playing a gimmick. And the opponent is just an aside, just there just to distract you. So you never really are thinking about how to defeat an opponent, you're thinking about how to deal with fucking time limits. Blizzard and their fucking time limits everywhere. Everything in fucking Blizzard shit is time limits. Even when they don't have a timer on your screen, it always amounts to some stupid fucking time limit. Just because of the way the objectives are done. Because they don't want you sitting there and actually playing the fucking game. Whereas destroying the enemy's base and stuff like that, that's supposed to be the fruit of your labor. That's supposed to be your victory moment. That's supposed to be the condition to winning that you've worked hard to obtain. But you never get there. So every time you get through a mission, you never feel fucking accomplished. At the most, you feel relief that you finally overcome another piece of shit that maybe you had some problems with because of how fucking tedious it was. Because you were playing something that this entire fucking game, even StarCraft 2, was never built for. StarCraft 2 was never built for anything than playing a fucking RTS. It may be a shitty RTS. It's still an RTS. No point in a fucking campaign are you playing an RTS. You're never going to feel immersed or engaged by it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's like pretty much the biggest issue with all of the campaigns that I've played is that even when they're trying to be an RTS, they're just a grind and a slog, and it's like AI that's being hyper defensive. If they're there at all, they send like 3 Marines at you, and otherwise they'll defend with like 40 battlecruisers. But so it's just like boring. And you have to go hunting for that engagement yourself instead of the game demanding that you do that. At that point, you can expand to cover the entire map, and it doesn't matter if you have 20 APM or 2,000. Like, it's still the same result. It just, like that, your APM will depend on, or your speed will depend on your APM and how engaged you're making yourself. But, the map doesn't require a certain threshold. And that's like a big issue.
Is why AI is so fucking important. That is why AI is your most powerful storytelling element, because every single thing we've talked about, like the terrain and team play and the characters, all that all fucking ties into the AI. If you don't have AI, you just can't do it. You can't make an RTS. You can't make a campaign.
I think it's important
AI is the most driving important tool that you have behind every single one of these. Terrain doesn't make a damn of a difference. Characters don't make a damn of a difference. Your tech trees and shit don't make a damn of a difference. If it's just the player interacting with static shit. That's what every single thing about this comes down to.
It's not an RTS, but as an example of exactly what you're talking about, where you're mentioning all these components that are important, but not as important, not penultimate. I recently played the Half-Life 1 series, including its expansion packs.
Oh, no.
And surprisingly, the game state, the weapons, the enemies of the first expansion, Opposing Force, is actually more compelling to me on a theoretical sense than the levels and the stuff that we experienced in the first game. The problem is that the AI is stupid. It runs into walls. The fucking levels are designed around gimmicks and stuff instead of actually playing an FPS. So it's like the same precept, is that they may have made a much better or marginally better game state to play in. Like, that might be more fun to play in multiplayer. That might be more challenging if you were up against an enemy that was also using all those same tools that you have, or an enemy race that was actually putting together compositions of enemies, like some of the new enemies that they added. And like, that was challenging in a different way, that they combined their tactics and you had to choose how to pick them apart and stuff. And it's like the same concept for an RTS. It's the same exact concept. It just depends on what actual mechanics are being employed in this case. And so that's definitely an example, I think, that sort of proves what we're talking about, right? It adds fuel for our argument. Another
Although
thing that
I haven't finished it,
yeah,
honestly, as far as shooters are concerned, other than the ones that introduce QuickTime events, I think Half-Life 1 probably has the worst gameplay of any shooter I've yet to play.
Yeah, well, there's not really much gameplay at all is the problem. Yeah.
It is absolutely fucking terrible. I didn't realize it until someone mentioned it in your chat before when we were talking about it, but this is a fucking definitive corridor shooter. This is what led to shit like fucking Halo turning into a grindfest, is because they looked at the example Half-Life 1 made. Half-Life 1 is literally like where the fucking shooter genre died. This is really where it started.
It's all because of a lack of consistency, though. Like, think about it. Because you never fucking do the same thing at any point in any of the experience that you're playing.
You never do anything in it. It's just a series of fucking chores and brain-dead shit standing in your way.
Yeah. And on top of that, you have to climb through vents and do fucking platforming and shit. Like, what? Why? The fucking helicopter section, I don't know if you've got to that yet, but if you don't save a certain weapon type in your inventory, that's just a quick time event that you have to figure out how to do, because like it's just as Simon says, but that doesn't tell you. Simon doesn't tell you what to say, but he's saying something, and you don't have the fuck. He's saying something in another language you don't even fucking understand, and so
you
like
gotta
that's sort
clap
of the thing.
His Russian ass cheeks.
Yeah. Good luck, man. If you're gonna finish that production, good fucking luck.
I'm gonna try to sometime.
Yeah.
But no, it's like I played a lot of Counter-Strike with bots and shit. And I feel like I got more compelling fucking storytelling out of fucking Counter-Strike bot games than any shooter like Half-Life 1 has ever provided. Because at least you get like the bots, like, because I would set up the bots with different fucking skill levels. So there'll be some of the bots with the really jacked up accuracy and reflexes. And then I would set them up with custom weapons. So the strongest of them all was the ones that use the auto snipers, because those are just fucking broken.
Yeah.
And when the AI has super high reflexes and shit like that, you have to really think how to even approach them, because they'll just snap around and instantly kill you. It's kind of stupid, but the net result is if this guy's got money and he buys his gun, you've got a serious fucking threat on your hands you're going to have to figure out how to deal with, unless he just kills himself by shooting a wall or something, because the AI is kind of stupid. But now you have some kind of interaction going on. It's a really simple interaction, again, but this is more than what you have in fucking Half-Life 1. Because Half-Life 1, you have nothing. You have no characters. You have no storytelling. You fucking nothing. You don't even think about what's going on at any point. You're just walking through fucking halls, just smacking shit and hitting their bodies and creating a machine gun of sounds that are very loud.
I'm glad that that's broken on your version too, man. That's so stupid.
Yeah, that... Why is that broke?
I don't know, dude. That's a really buggy game. Don't stand in any elevators as they come down. You'll get clipped into them and die. So just jump when the elevator lands, and you'll be safe. So that's sort of the caliber of shit that you're dealing with.
This goes back to, because I played Killzone 2 and Killzone 3. Those are LPs. It's literally the same fucking thing, except now with infinitely spawning enemies, which is apparently very common, because I remember Modern Warfare is like that too, where they use a lot of infinitely spawning enemies. You were just inside you have to go past the trigger volume to turn off the infinitely spawning enemies. So the way you get through the game is not by fighting the enemies, it's by rushing past everything and getting to that point where they stop spawning, and then get rid of whatever you need to do to do the objective.
Yeah, that's an illness. I don't understand why that would ever...
Like,
why
at what point did this shooters become like this? Like, the AI in all these games is all the fucking same. They sit in cover and they have a timer and they pop their heads out and you shoot them. That is how every single fucking one of those fucking cover shooters plays. That is why they are such shit, and why I'll always stand by, UT99 and Quake 3 being the best shooters. Because even if they don't have a single player, even if you don't even think about the single player, just think about general bot gameplay on maps, that is infinitely better than all these fucking cinematic, realistic, herd definition shooters that have come out in the past 20 years. They're all shit.
Yeah, and I think that if you were to draw this back to RTS stuff, like, I look at the lack of consistency in an FPS, and I completely just immediately gravitate it towards the RTS. Like, the thing is, when you're dealing with campaigns, and you have like different maps obviously as time goes on, and it is a linear experience in the sense that you progress from map 1 to map 2 to map 3 and so on. Like in an RTS environment, one could like a pleb mongoloid who hasn't learned how to read could just be like, oh, isn't that the same thing as going through and saying like, Half-Life is bad because its levels are linear, and but it's not, because like the point isn't that you have to have multiplayer maps that you always revisit, which is like
The point
Brood
is that
War.
your experience is very narrow.
Yeah, your experience is super narrow, and like of course things are going to be linear in a single player content because like the AI can only respond in so many different ways. So at some point you're going to wind up with something linear. But the point isn't to try to make something that's non-linear. It's to try to make it so that there's enough wiggle room within the linearity that you're constrained by in the game that you can do different things, that your AI can do different things. Maybe that's a randomizer. Maybe that's some other shit where the AI just has some threat assessment that makes it do different things depending on certain other reads. Maybe it is just a flat RNG where it decides what its build order is based on some other thing. Maybe you read how well the player did, like you read their par time and you adjust the AI's build order to counter that. Like if the par time is really quick, then you know that the player is finding success with rushes. So maybe the next mission the AI adapts by not being a little bit more defensive or rushing them back or doing something else that theoretically the other AI didn't previously do to the player and catches the player off guard. Obviously within the constraints of what the players and the AI's personalities are, so that you're not contradicting what the AI is actually capable of doing as an individual and what their personality is like and how they're just constructed as an individual. But there's a bunch of different things that you can do to make it so that there's a non-linear, more dynamic element to the gameplay, even though at the end of the day, yes, it is linear. There's only so many things that can happen. In an RTS especially, but also in an FPS, there's so many different things that you can do to change up the gameplay and make it so that it's not the same thing every single time. And I don't just mean that you don't find the same fucking bugs in Half-Life 1 every time you go play it. I mean like actually genuinely different in a way that matters, in a way that is evocative of some sort of experience that players want to go back and opt into again after they play. And that's one of the challenges behind making something like Hydra, where I do want it to be, just the fact that it's optional co-op obviously means that like somebody might play the campaign 3 times because 3, and then play with 3 different people each time. And because it's 2-player co-op, they can have, a different experience each time just by nature of who's there. Or they can play some co-op and some single player, and the AI ally that takes over the missing human player will take control and do that stuff. Like however they want to do it. But even beyond that sort of superficial change where it's just a different experience because of the number of human players that can be implemented, the fact is that the AI should have a set personality, and they shouldn't deviate so much from it. Like you said, Larry might use completely different unit compositions, but their tactics are going to remain similar, and that's going to be grounded in who he is as an individual. Like that's the same idea. It's like your enemies in an FPS can also be, use different weapons, like Halo's elites or something, but if they use similar tactics where they are going to try to negotiate with the give orders to their squad mates or something, and that's going to dictate like all of a sudden just by making it so that the gameplay experience changes based on what the AI's orders are. Like in the case of an FPS where you have a squad leader, then the members of his squad will determine the outcome of the game to some degree. That will determine the encounter or some nature of the encounter. And if he's just alone, that's also going to change stuff. If he's with if he's subservient to somebody else, but it's normally a leader of his own, like that's going to change things. Like just immediately, there's a bunch of shit that you could do, but none of the AI ever interact with each other, which is one of the reasons why I was interested in pressing you about the whole team thing. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more in depth later. But like team AI cooperating together synergizing with their compositions and maybe aggressing and expanding at the same time or something like that. I've got a couple of maps in Hydra that I want to do, and that is in some ways considerably, like you could imagine that could be accused of being a set piece, but I think it's just an AI doing something that you wouldn't normally see them, because it's a team of AI trying to cooperate. If you're able to isolate one of them and kill them off, then the other one's going to be, they're going to have to compensate for the fact that they no longer have an AI ally to, just like a human player would have to compensate if their AI ally dies, this guy will too. And actually making it so they engage with each other is really important, I think.
Yeah, well, it makes sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a duh statement, but the fact that it remains that so many people are hailing games like Half-Life and Deus Ex and whatever else that seem to have no fucking AI to speak of, and yet they're hailing them for things like, I would understand if they just like the soundtrack or some weird superficial thing, or they just happen to grow up with it or whatever, but they're claiming that Half-Life and other games like it, that they have elements of dynamic gameplay, that they aren't linear, and that's why they like them. And like these are just objectively false claims. So that's what triggers me mostly.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even really like when I make stuff, I don't even look at it like about non-linearity, because I feel like that if you like go out of your way to make stuff non-linear, in certain cases it turns into a big mess. It's just about
Yeah, it's a
being
risk.
honest. It's
Yeah.
about being honest. Because like when I look at StarCraft, any of the StarCraft, any of the campaigns, or Warcraft 3, it's not even an RTS. So when I think of it like an RTS, like to me, like tracking certain kinds of data, like what the player does, and having the AI, expand and defend and build stuff and change your tech, like that to me isn't even about linearity. That's just how it should work. Like that's how a player works. It's not even about replicating what the player does, which is kind of what Blizzard tried to do with the melee AI halfway and just gave up on, evidently. But it's just like just having it like the player is playing an RTS. The AI is always going to be weaker than the player in many other ways. So sometimes we have to give them resources or give them, even inhuman reflexes in some cases to try to close the gap a little bit. But at the end of the day, it's still the experience we're looking at. We're still got to deal with macro and economy and expanding, and then look at the team play and stuff like that. That's just what you do in an RTS. It's just what it makes sense. It's just about being honest to what we're trying to do. And at the end of the day, I'm going to end up with something that looks like nothing like StarCraft. But that's okay because I've taken the strong elements out of Supreme Commander, I've taken the strong elements of StarCraft, and I've tried to mesh them together in a single player experience, which is going to be not as good as the multiplayer experience in an equivalent in a good matchup. But we're not playing a multiplayer experience, we're playing a campaign. And the whole point of the campaign ultimately is to have some kind of story with an experience associated with it and to mesh it all together. But the best way to go through it is certainly to have engagement. And engagement comes from immersion. And the best way you get immersed is by being challenged. And the best way you have challenge is by really making people think and having to actually stay focused on the game. And I think you're close to your time limit, if I remember. So to wrap that up, when I look at my projects and I look at how I proceed from mission to mission to mission, I don't even think of I try to stay intentionally linear in how stuff is deployed. But I think of once you get into the mission, everything that you do is going to change because other than this bunker rush and the tank contain and some bullies that we use, the only other bullies I'm going to be using is for some base layouts, which is equivalent to the base layout command that you're using.
Right.
Everything the AI does otherwise is going to be largely left up to the galaxy governing how the AI behaves.
Well, even the base layouts themselves are like
specific stuff.
It's like an approximation of what a player would want to do. A player with that personality would want to do in that situation. You're just hard coding it because that's the limitation of the engine. You don't have an algorithm that will automatically do that you can, tweak and specify so that it works within the confines of what that personality of that AI actually is. It's the same thing with like the tank contain and the bunker rush. And the idea is that this AI wants to do this. How are they going to do this in this map? I'm going to have to hard code it or only leave a certain number of options. But it's because you're basically hard coding the algorithm instead of actually having an algorithm, and just because of a tech restraint, as opposed to something that's deliberately trying to be, linear and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we're trying to avoid situations like the Rainer, was it Rainer Kerrigan fucking push map in StarCraft 2 Heathis Swarm or something where they build everything at bullies and then throw everything on waves. That are a timer. That's like the pinnacle of the kind of stuff that we stay away from. Is everything always happens at this point and does this stuff. I mean, stuff is still based on timers. There's still gonna be some static elements, but the AI will change directions and targets based on where things are. That alone is going to change stuff. And the text switches can have conditions and other kinds of things associated with them. It's just about like we're trying to. In a way, I'm actually simplifying that stuff a lot because in order to set up these missions like what Blizzard has, you have to build all these triggers and build all these conditions and then build some kind of logic that sort of surrounds it. Like the shuttles, for example. If you want the shuttles to have escorts, because they have escorts, you then have to have the AI either spawn or make units and then assign them to a guard and then escort it. So now we have to have all this extra logic that we've made map specific. Whereas my stuff, like 99% of these maps, the only triggers they have is for dialogue, and that's it. The cinematics are going to be their own fucking maps, so you don't even have to load the shit for them. You don't even have to skip them. They're just their own thing that's loaded independently. The map basically starts as far as the AI, and there's defeat and win conditions, and that's it for a very large chunk of them. As far as gameplay logic is concerned, it's actually simpler to make this stuff.
Funny anecdote, actually. Desler,
fucking RTS.
I think it was in his Celestial Eruption document, but Oh, wait, did Desler make Celestial? I think so. I don't remember. They all blend together now, but I'm pretty sure it's Desler. And he said that it was lazy to use AI because it wasn't scripted.
Well, that's because they don't know what AI is.
Yes. Despite not
That's
knowing
the
what AI
remarks of
is.
someone who's never done anything with it.
Yeah. Despite not knowing what it is, though, he definitely did hit that on the money. It is actually simpler to just do it in a script as opposed to having to, hard set everything. I think it's a sign of like that's what you look at from like programming school or whatever. Like if you're taking a programming class, one of the first things that they try to teach you is to not hard set everything, not inline everything. And yet, of course, you open up StarCraft Source and all you see is a bunch of inline fucking functions and just decide to off yourself instead of trying to decode those. Rest in peace, iQuare. I really I hope that you survive this because this is going to be a disaster. But
well, here's a recent example. I mentioned in the last podcast I was going to get an Unreal 4. I was going to ditch the StarCraft 2 shit. And there was this project that was released, melee combat project, that looked like it had everything I wanted for learning information. It had melee combat, it had an AI, and it had all this stuff. I would learn that the fucking AI is not even in the AI system that Unreal uses, which is called Blackboard. It's in blueprints. It's in general blueprints. And the animation speeds and walk run speeds and all this other shit, unrelated, is all baked into the same fucking code that the AI is in. Like,
why?
It is. Yeah. Like, it doesn't even make any sense, but that's how it is. It's all this giant mass of embedded shit, which doesn't make it more or less efficient. It's just more work to fucking go through and much harder to learn. And you look at, like, the AI decision making, and then between all this blocks of shit of the AI just doing stuff based on distance, you have the animation speeds and the run and walk speeds and all this other like unrelated stuff built into the AI when they should be two entirely separate things.
Yeah.
But for some reason, they built it this way to make it more annoying to go through. Like, I don't understand there is no logic. Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, the AI should work regardless of what its settings are, just like the AI in StarCraft should work. Like, obviously, you're going to have to hard set its, like, build order or whatever, but...
This isn't even hard set.
Yeah.
This is, like, entirely irrelevant information all stacked together. This is like if the galaxy code for the AI in StarCraft was dynamically changing the stats of all the units for mission-specific stats. Like, if my AI says, I'm going to build 5 Marines, set the 5 Marines to have 40 health. That is literally what's going on here.
I have no idea then. That's psychotic.
Like, before you start getting into shit stacking all this crap on top of each other and making gimmicks, you gotta figure out how the base game works. And I don't think any of these people like Dessler even understood the tiniest filament of how the base game works before they started making assumptions about what AI can or cannot do for them.
Well, that's what you would expect if you're making Celestial Eruption and any of these other fucking... I don't know. He just had some comment about how you could almost feel the skin of some Protoss character, and I mean, why are
That's lewd.
All these micro campaign authors, or just lunatic campaign authors, are all like furries or something? I don't get it, man.
I think he just that's not really furry because Protoss are plants, right?
Scaly.
So I don't know if it's like a
veggie.
Like, there's probably another word for it. Veggie. Yeah, veggie's good. Let's go with that.
All right. Well, we coined a new term today, boys. This is a very productive podcast. No, thanks once again for joining me, and I'm sure we'll be back sooner rather than later, but we'll see how the schedule works out. Was there any final thoughts you wanted to close on as far as the consistency and RTS thing goes?
It's probably best left for another podcast.
Yeah,
but I wonder if the uncle will ever escape the toilet.
Oh, you're talking about Uncle Barrow?
Yes. He has joined and left that server over a dozen fucking times that I know of.
Well, it's every time as a new account. It's even more confusing. Because they're all banned, so...
I wonder if Blizzard's just making sure you're not talking shit about Hong Kong.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. We should do a Hong Kong special
preemptively.
Sometime. Yeah.
Preemptively.
Well, I think that'll do it for us. Thanks.
Yep.
Get fucked.
Get raped.